Today in class we talked about how to find the trigonometric ratios, the sine, cosine, and tangent of a right triangle in terms of how those are defined, because they're ratios of side lengths. So for instance, for sine, it's the ratio of the opposite over the hypotenuse. For cosine, it's the ratio of the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And tangent is the ratio of the opposite over adjacent. So first of all, defining them just in terms of these are ratios, looking at some relationships here, that the sine of one of the acute angles is going to be exactly the same as the cosine of the other one, and vice versa. The two tangents are reciprocals of each other because it really depends on where you are on the triangle as to what's your opposite and what's your adjacent. Keeping in mind, we're never going to be looking at it from the perspective of angle C. We don't do it from the right angle. We only do it looking at it from the two acute angles in the right triangle. So if I'm looking at the world from angle A, this is my adjacent, this is my opposite, this is my hypotenuse. If I move over here to angle B, the adjacent and the opposite would flip-flop. That's why these two go together, and these two go together, and these two become reciprocals, because those are those adjacent and opposite. All right, so we talked about that. We did some stuff with that, and now we're at the point where we are finding missing side lengths using these ratios. So step one in doing that is figuring out where am I standing on this triangle. What is my perspective if I'm looking at the world from angle D or angle F? I would generally say go with the one that you're given. So we're given angle 51, the 51 degrees for angle D, so that's where I'm going to base everything from. Hypotenuse, it's always across from the right angle, so here it is. Okay. The next one to find, if you have trouble finding this, I would suggest look at, first off, the hypotenuse and then the adjacent, because whatever angle you are looking at the world from, in this case angle D, it consists of two sides. One of them is the hypotenuse, the other one is the adjacent. So if that's the hypotenuse, this is the adjacent. So that makes the adjacent rather easy to find. Then the one that you haven't mentioned yet, across on the other side of the triangle, that's your opposite. So that's the first thing, is figuring out what angle am I standing at, basically. What angle is my perspective coming from? And then what are those sides with respect to that angle? Which one's the opposite of that angle? Which one's adjacent to that angle? Now, the next thing is, what am I being asked for? I'm being asked for DF. Okay, that's the hypotenuse. So I'm going to let that be my x. Okay, so x is for DF, the length of DF. 17 is the length of EF, and I don't know anything about the length of DE. So I'm going to use, in terms of how do I know what to use, sine, cosine, or tangent, I need to know what am I working with. I'm working with these two sides. The one that I have, which is the 17, and the one that I need, which is the x. So the two sides I'm working with here are the opposite and the hypotenuse. So going back over here, I want to use the one that deals with opposite and hypotenuse, excuse me, which is sine. I won't use either of these because they are not relating the opposite and the hypotenuse to each other. So the whole reason I'm choosing to use sine is because of what I'm working with, the opposite and the hypotenuse, and that's the definition of sine. So I set up an equation from that definition. The definition says sine of an angle, in this case it's 51 degrees, equals opposite, that's the 17, over the hypotenuse, which is the x. Now this is a proportion. It doesn't have a 1 on the bottom, but it can. So we'll go ahead and put that there. The way we solve a proportion is by cross multiplying. So that's what I'm going to do next. Please notice that I have not picked up my calculator yet. So I'm going to cross multiply this, and I get sine of 51 times x equals 17 times 1. All right. Now, am I ready to pick up the calculator? Still no, because x is not alone. Once you have set up your proportion, you go ahead and you solve by cross multiplying and doing whatever you can to get x alone on one side. That's what solving is, getting x alone on one side. If x isn't alone on one side, then you haven't solved. All right, so now to get x alone on one side, looks like I need to divide. How do I know what to do? I know by looking at what I have and using my equation solving skills. In other words, if I have something times x, the way to get rid of times is division. Now x is alone. When x is finally alone, that's when it's time to go to your calculator. That's when it's time to pick up the calculator and say, okay, this tells me that in order to find the missing side, x, I have to divide 17 divided by sine of 51. A fraction means division. So I will do 17 divided by sine 51. That gives me 21.8749. Since it said round to the nearest hundredth, x is about 21.87 meters, I believe is the unit. That's my answer for A. All right, part B here. Where do we start with part A? We have to start the same place here, and that is, which angle do I want to use? I want to use T. Once I know that I'm using T, I've got to identify where my opposite is, where my adjacent is, and my hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is right here. T has two sides. One of them's the hypotenuse, the other one's always going to be your adjacent. So this is the adjacent. And finally, that means that SU is the opposite. Now I want to know, what am I looking for? I'm looking for ST. ST is right here, so this becomes my X. So I'm working with the adjacent because I need to find it, and I'm working with the hypotenuse because it's the one that I was given. So adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine. If you look back at the definitions, cosine is adjacent and hypotenuse. So I can set up my equation. The cosine of 42 degrees equals adjacent over hypotenuse. That's the equation I need to solve. First thing I'm going to do that is cross multiply. 9.5 times cosine of 42 equals x. Is x alone? Yes, x is alone. So I'm ready to pick up the calculator and multiply. 9.5 times cosine 42. And I get 7.06, looks like. X is about 7.06, and I think that's inches. Now, a couple things to point out here. You might have done this in a different order from me, and that's fine. It is perfectly fine if I do cosine of 42 times 9.5. I get the same thing. But here's what you've got to notice. If I put the cosine, the sine, or the tangent first, it's super important that I close that parentheses right there, or parenthesis. Okay, it's very important that I have a closed parentheses there, because otherwise it would think that my whole angle was 42 times 9.5 degrees. Okay, I have to tell it, oh, the angle is just 42 degrees, end of angle, times side length 9.5. All right, up here it's not a big deal because I'm done, so I don't have anything that's coming behind it, so it's okay if I leave it open. I could close it, that's fine, it's not a bad habit to get into. But it's super important that I don't do this, which is a very common mistake. You see how the calculator is going to read that? It thinks that all of this is the angle I'm taking the cosine of, and I get a very different answer. Okay, so be careful about that. Another thing is, when you're doing your cross multiplying, remember that cosine of something, sine of something, tangent of something, these things, tan of an angle, they're all of an angle. They stay together. I would never separate the cosine and the 42 or the sine and the 51. They just cannot be taken apart. They stay together. It's one thing. So let's go ahead and look at C here. First thing is which angle? Well, it looks like I'm doing it from B. Next thing is, what sides do I have? Well, here's the hypotenuse. And remember, the angle that you're working with has two sides. One is hypotenuse, one is adjacent. So here is adjacent. And this is opposite. Okay, what do I need? I need BC. So here's my X. So X is adjacent. Which side am I not using this time? I'm not going to use hypotenuse. That rules out sine and cosine because both of them are over hypotenuse. I'm not using the hypotenuse because I am working with the side that I'm given, which is the opposite, and the side that I need, which is the adjacent. So I'm going to use tangent because tangent equals opposite over adjacent. So tan of 18 degrees equals opposite, which is 12, over adjacent, which is my x. Put this over 1. Tan of 18 times x equals 12. And notice I put that in parentheses to emphasize that this is all one thing. Like if I wrote it without parentheses, I might get confused and think it's tan of 18x. Like the angle is 18x. Not true. Tan of 18 is a number, and I'm multiplying it times x. Now, x is still not alone, so I still don't need my calculator. I need to figure out how to get x alone. And notice it's different things on different problems. There's not a one-time magical, oh, you always do this. You always set up the equation. You always cross-multiply. But after that, you let the equation solving process tell you what you're going to put in the calculator. You do whatever you have to do to both sides to get x alone. And then when x is alone, that tells me I'm going to do 12 divided by tan of 18. And that gives me 36.93. Feet. Oops, let me leave that for a second. Okay, last but not least is D here. On D, I'm going to go at this from angle K. Let me just put this right here. Okay, angle K is right here. So this is hypotenuse. This is adjacent. I'm sorry, it's weird. This is opposite, and that's the side I want, is the x, which is the opposite. So I'm going to use opposite and hypotenuse, and that's sine. Sine of k equals opposite over hypotenuse. I'm sorry, I wrote k, but I know what k is. If you know what k is, fill it in. We do. We know that it's 27. Okay, so sine of 27 equals x over 13.6. Cross multiply 13.6 times sine of 27. Remember to close the parentheses if you have anything behind that in your calculator. Equals x. This is what I'm being told to do by my equation. 13.6 times sine of 27. And I get 6.17. So x is about 6.17 centimeters. And there's my answer. One quick tip is if you want to double check yourself to see if you set it up right, remember that your answer should make sense in terms of the sides of a triangle. And by that I mean the fact that the hypotenuse is always supposed to be the biggest side. So if I'm looking for one of the legs, I better make sure that my answer is smaller than the hypotenuse, which it is here. And like on part A here, letter A, if I'm looking for a hypotenuse, then I better make sure that my answer, 21.87, is bigger than any legs, 17, which it is. So that can help you tell if you made a mistake. Your homework is in your textbook. It is page 321, 1 through 21, and page 322, (37 to 39). Okay? Keep in mind, in your textbook, you can check odd answers. So I would especially encourage you on like number 19 to check your answer. Number 19, number 21, check your answer. Number 37, 39. That's the only reason I would love to see you do 40 to 42. And if you're getting all the answers right, or even to 43, if you're getting all the answers right, go ahead. But I don't want to have you practice too many if you're incorrect. So double check those ones where you're finding the missing side length to make sure you're doing them right as you go.